Alrighty, tighty, lefty, loosey. So that's the immune response. Hopefully, you're less confused than a mosquito in a mannequin factory. And in this video, what we're going to talk about is how the COVID-19 outbreak, pandemic, is related to the immune response and kind of your immune response to COVID-19. So let's talk a little bit about what this is. So the virus name is actually called SARS-CoV-2. So the reason why it's called this is because this is what it causes. It's severe acute respiratory syndrome, and then it's CoV stands for coronavirus. So that's the class of viruses that this is. And then there was actually one back in early 2000s or something, or sometime, and that's CoV-1. So this is the second time we've had a severe acute respiratory syndrome virus that was a coronavirus, and so they called it CoV-2. Right, the disease name is actually COVID-19, so that stands for coronavirus disease, and then it popped up. I think it was early November of 2019. Yeah, and so what it causes is this respiratory disease. So the reason why they're called coronaviruses is because there's this little. If you take a electron microscope and take an electromicrograph, there's this little crown around the actual virion. So this is a virus particle or a virion. There's a little crown around it. And so with this crown, it's not actually a crown, right? It's actually a whole bunch of proteins that are on the cells that are on the virus surface. And we'll talk about what that so we'll talk about this right here. So coronaviruses, right, have a membrane around their virus, right? And so this is just like a cellular membrane, right? A cellular membrane is a lipid bilayer that is surrounding the cell cytoplasm. Well, this is the same principle here, right? This is actually a double lipid bilayer. It's actually taken from the host cell, and it's a bilayer that surrounds the inside of the virion. Now, this membrane right here is studded with a whole bunch of transmembrane proteins, right? So proteins that span that membrane, and one of these proteins is what's called a spike protein, and that's what's actually you're looking at when you see this electron micrograph and these little red little thingies. That's the spike protein, and so that's what comprises the outside of the virion. Inside, well, it's very simple. All there is a RNA molecule, right? So ribonucleic acid. So it has the 2' oxygen is oxygenated, so it's not deoxy. It's just ribonucleic acid. And then RNA in and of itself is very unstable, and so it needs to be protected. And it uses proteins called nucleoproteins or capsid proteins to protect that RNA. And so that's these little globs that are binding to the RNA. So that's what the virus looks like. So the virus, what it does is it causes a whole bunch of problems of your respiratory tract. And so let's talk a little bit about what that respiratory tract looks like. So your respiratory tract starts with your nose and your mouth. And there's those two openings to the body meet at this region right here called the pharynx. But then the pharynx continues on and goes to the trachea. Now the trachea is a tube that leads down to your lungs. And in your lungs, at the end of this tube, at the end of these bronchioles, right? So the trachea breaks out into bronchi, and then those go into bronchioles, and then at the end of these bronchioles are what's called alveoli. And alveoli are little air sacs, and that's where the oxygen comes in and can get the oxygen get into your body. And then oxygen, I don't know if y'all have learned this, acts as the terminal electron acceptor of the electron transport chain within the mitochondria of cells, right? And so that's the critical need of oxygen in your body, and that gas exchange happens at your lungs in these alveoli. And so what happens with the virus is that it actually can transmit. It can take advantage of this to transmit from person to person. So what happens is the virus enters into the body and just starts infecting all of this tissue that's all around this here, right? And so it infects this region called the the nasopharyngeal tissue right here. So if you get like a little coronavirus test, they're going to stick a tube way down your nose and they're going to get inside this nasopharyngeal and see if there's virus here, which if you're infected, there will be. But this virus goes all the way down, infects your trachea, infects all this stuff right here, and then eventually infects your bronchi. And then what happens is that it replicates in all this tissue, and then eventually you'll cough or you'll sneeze little droplets out, and then those droplets will contain viruses, and then when another person is around and breathes that in through their mouth or their nose, it then infects the next person. And so that's how it transmits from person to person. But one of the critical steps, right, is the virus replicating to a high number in your body. And so this is how the virus replicates to a high degree. This is the virology of the virus. This is something that I study personally, not coronavirus, but a different virus. So what happens is that a coronavirus, what it does is it uses the spike proteins we talked about to bind to cells, and the protein that it binds to is called a virus receptor. And then once the virus binds, it then fuses this membrane with the cell membrane, and what that results in is it releases that RNA into the cytoplasm. And RNA, if you remember, right, mRNA, what it does is it binds to ribosomes and goes through translation. So the RNA is going to bind to a ribosome and then start translation. Well, what is it translating? It's translating all of the necessary proteins it needs to infect or to replicate, right? And so it's going to translate these nucleoproteins and these membrane proteins and the spike proteins, right? The spike protein is a membrane protein. But eventually, once all of these proteins are made and translated, it will result in a mature virion being formed, and then this mature virion will then be released out into the environment, and it can either infect cells or go inside of droplets to transmit to other people. And so that's how the virus replication works for coronaviruses. Now, the problem is when we talk about the immunology, right? So we talked about just some basic immunology. Well, this is specifically what's happening in the coronaviruses. What's happening is that normally with your alveoli, you have these ciliated tissue that leads to the alveoli, right? So cilia, we talked about, was one of those physical barriers that microbes can get trapped in, and these cilia can then remove microbes. So theoretically, coronavirus should be binding to these little cilia and then being removed and not causing any problems because that's your physical innate barrier, right? But it does get past those. And then in a healthy, right, alveoli, there are alveolar macrophages, which is just a macrophage that lives in the alveoli. And there's also NK cells, right? And so these are innate leukocytes that are scanning everything and making sure everything's good. And then if everything's good, you'll then have these neutrophils, right, just circulating, and they're not being recruited, and everything is healthy, dandy, and fine, right? The problem is that when a person gets infected, right, the virus creeps into the alveoli, and it causes this disease called acute respiratory distress syndrome, or ARDS. And what happens with ARDS, the first thing it does, right, it wants to remove the physical innate immune system, right? And so it tries to remove all of these cells right here that are ciliated. So it's going to remove the cilia and then also slough off, which is just like falling off. These cells then just kind of get removed, right? The second thing it does is that it's going to infect these alveolar cells. Well, at first, right before, you breathe it in into your lungs, and there's an extracellular, it kind of exists out in the extracellular environment, and then infects. But while it's outside of the cells, right, these macrophages, these alveolar macrophages, are going to start phagocytizing and eating the coronavirus, right? But then eventually it'll infect the the alveoli cells, and then these are intracellular. It then becomes an intracellular pathogen, and intracellular pathogens, right, activate NK cells, natural killer cells, and natural killer cells release cytokines that induce apoptosis. So all these cells then start to die. Additionally, these macrophages are going to activate neutrophils to come out of the body, out of the bloodstream and into the lungs, and then it's going to, neutrophils also actually release cytokines. But eventually it leads to just massive amounts of death along this, in the alveoli. Now, when cells die, it releases all of the cytoplasm into the actual alveoli, and there's a whole bunch of liquid that gets released and starts to build up. Well, if there's a whole bunch of liquid here, it's hard to breathe, right? You can't have an efficient gas exchange if there's a whole bunch of liquid covering all the cells that do the gas exchange. And so because there's a whole bunch of liquid here, it's hard to breathe. And so it causes this respiratory distress, because all of this liquid is just building up inside of the alveoli. And what's interesting is that you can actually see this liquid build up in an X-ray. So this is what a normal healthy lung looks like, and this is what someone infected with COVID-19's lungs look like. So a healthy lung, you'll realize that there's a whole bunch of black space, right? And so that's just a whole bunch of empty air space, right? That means that there's a whole bunch of air there, and so there's efficient gas exchange. But when you see a whole bunch of white, that's problematic, because that means there's a whole bunch of liquid in your lungs, and so that liquid comes from, right, destruction of those cells and your immune response. So what's interesting to note here is that the virus itself isn't actually doing the damage. It's actually the immune response that's largely doing the damage. And so this is called an immunopathogenic disease. That means the immune system is the problem, right? Immunopathogenic disease. And so this is why you get the symptoms that you get when you have coronavirus, right? So you have shortness of breath because you can't breathe, right? There's a whole bunch of liquid in your lungs that is preventing you from being breathing, and your alveoli also are just infected, and then there's inflammation here, right? Just like you have swelling from a mosquito bite, you have swelling inside of your actual lungs, and so there's not an efficient gas exchange because everything's so swollen and big, right? You also have a dry cough because, right, the cilia are being agitated and being removed from what they're supposed to be doing, and then you have a fever as well. That's part of the inflammatory response to try to prevent this virus from really taking over. So, right, what the government has said is they try to understand these methods and then prevent further infections. So the first thing they told us was to wash our hands, right? So what this does is it prevents you probably saw me touch my face like 50,000 times over the past videos, right? You touch your face and then viruses on your hands, right, which has that innate immune skin, right, preventing it from getting inside of you. Well, when you touch your nose, you allow the virus to get inside of your respiratory tract, and then it just takes over, right? And so what happens if you wash your hands, you remove that virus, and then you can touch your nose and then nothing happens, right? And so that's why I tell you to wash your hands and then wear face masks for the same reason, right? And so when someone sneezes in public, right, the face mask reduces the probability that a virus can actually get in because it's stuck inside in the face mask and not not getting inside of you. And then social distancing, of course, prevents that transmission from person to person, and that also allows kind of the people to go, or the infections to go down. So that's why you're being told to do all this stuff, and that's why kind of how your immune system is involved into with the coronavirus, and how if all things are going right, your immune system just removes the virus and you recover. But the problem is that if your immune system gets overactivated, right, you have ARDS and you can have respiratory problems and have all these symptoms. So that's just kind of an introduction, or that's kind of just a simple kind of explanation as to what's going on in the coronavirus pandemic.